Dystopian fiction has been moved to current affairs.
Hello, and welcome to episode 18 of Dystopian Fiction Has Been Moved to Current Affairs. You're listening to Clare and Masha, and we are going to discuss today The Truman Show, an amazing and quite kind of iconic film from 1998, which I realised that I remember watching at a sleepover, which tells you a lot about, well, I guess I was in year eight, so that's acceptable. But yeah, so what a great show. It's going on a little bit lighter than our last episode for anybody who still feels chilled by watching Threads. Go watch The Truman Show, which is, yeah, lighter, sad in its way, I suppose. And Marsha, you're going to have the unenviable task of telling us what this film is all about.
So, indeed, a very iconic movie, much beloved, I'd say. But so it follows the story of Truman Burbank, who is this man who sort of has been adopted from birth, by this corporation that has unknowingly made his whole entire life a reality television show. With all these hidden cameras and in this huge dome of a town that he lives in called Seahaven, which is sort of meant to be this almost utopia. And all of the people in Seahaven are actors, including his friends and his family. And sort of the film really kicks off when Truman starts to sort of see little cracks in this false reality that he lives in. And slowly his, I guess, curiosity peaks and he starts trying to uncover the truth. And the showrunner, I think Christof, tries to keep him confined, but Truman eventually is determined to sort of escape this reality and sort of sets his sights on freedom. And we sort of follow him as this is all kind of, this is all breaking down around him.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is almost quite just harrowing. I guess it's a bit of like a Plato's cave sort
It
of
is, or like an inverse
analogy.
Plato's cave in a
Yeah.
way, like because like in Plato's cave, all the people sitting in front of the fire don't know what's going on except the one who is freed and goes out and sees the real sun. But here it's like
Yeah,
everybody knows the truth except for
that's so
Truman.
true. That is so true.
So yeah, and as you say, it's kind of a we get a lot of sort of pathos for Truman, but also they're quite we always know as the viewers that he is in a TV show, but if
Yeah.
we didn't, he would be like a classic sort of conspiracy theorist, paranoid guy, like
Yes,
everybody's
yes.
watching me, and like so that's has a level of amusement. I thought we might start by talking about that kind of like the way that the film starts. I mean, there's like some really interesting sort of stuff on sort of in film studies about how this works, but it's like the film The Truman Show, which starts off with the TV show The Truman Show and like the background to it, and we're seeing a certain amount like as though it were on the show and a certain amount as though it were in the film, and those kind of blur together. But I do think that the opening, I was trying to think about what it was like to sort of see this for the first time. Well, I don't remember really, as I said, it was a long time ago, but that idea of like not quite knowing sort of like what was exactly going on, and
Hmm.
in terms of like the interviewing these actors who are actors in this TV show as well as actors in the film,
Mm.
and the focus at the beginning obviously on Christof, who will come back to, but also to begin with on like Marlon, the best friend from childhood, and Meryl. So we know from the start that we're going to be dealing with this kind of like meta sort of commentary on sort of a reality TV show, as well as the narrative of the film. I was thinking particularly about the way in which this like critique of sort of reality television is quite a good place to start, because Big Brother, the TV show,
Hmm.
started in 97. So this film was being made at the same time that that was becoming a thing. And it's also the same sort of time as I guess we get the rise in like music. reality TV, pop stars, pop idol, things like that had started. All of this was quite a new sort of format and idea. And so I mean, what is your feeling about, like, I guess the rise and rise of reality television? It seems to get like worse and worse, but also just like it doesn't go away. Like I'm a Celebrity and Love Island and things like that. This stuff is terrible.
No, it's really bad. I guess it feeds back into sort of, it's in the name reality TV, but I think I don't know how much of a culture there was around it at the beginning, but slowly more and more this reality is constructed, is kind of scripted in, or people are painted, there's a lot of, especially in sort of contests or whatever, or like especially in Love Island, for example, the producers will like edit things a certain way to make certain people on the show sort of like, I guess, characters, I don't know, classic villains, whatever. And I guess it kind of comes back to like getting that engagement. Is what do the people want to see? They want to see the drama. They want to see,
Why do you think we want to see that? I use we loosely because my general watching of reality TV
me and Clare,
is largely
avid engagers in reality TV.
Bake Off.
I love Bake Off. Is this like going to the reality TV umbrella? I guess again, I have a very specific idea of what.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of that sort of crossover. I mean, we've talked before about the way that like you get like dystopias of this sort of idea, like Squid Game, and then they made a game show, and you're just like,
you've completely missed the point. Like that's what is happening.
And you and I were talking about this sort of increased appeal of sort of dramas that are based on real life. So not even quite the sort of docudrama, but we were talking about the success of Baby Reindeer, for example. And what is it that makes people
sort of crave this
crave sort of like real life stories? Like has fiction become so like, if we become so disengaged from that kind of imagined world that if we don't sort of say this is based on a true story, we don't
that we just it's not worth engaging with, maybe. I don't know. I don't want to be sat here like blah, 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 the human condition, but I get, people maybe want like a representation. Maybe it's also finding comfort in the fact that like seeing someone else's life on TV can be sort of both, oh, I'm living it better than them, or maybe
isn't it mainly that like other people's lives going to shit on television is what we really want to see, or people who are like more stupid than we are, or having to do horrible things that we don't have to do, which is a very unpleasant reflection, isn't it, on kind of like what we look for. I mean, it's interesting that quite a lot of the sort of commentary on the Truman Show looks at this idea of this kind of like the fandom, the subculture, the people who seem to be living their lives kind of like vicariously through the show. The guy in the bath, I think, is quite a good sort of example of this, who, and the claim that people like leave it on all night because people find it comforting. But there's something about that failure to distinguish, I suppose, again, between kind of like the real and the faked. I mean, there's this bit in that opening sequence of interviews where like both it's the actress Hannah, played by the actress Laura Linney, playing the character of Meryl, Truman's wife, and also the same thing with Marlon, his best friend, the actor Louis, playing him, sort of saying, it's all real, nothing here is fake, it's merely controlled. But what's the difference, I suppose, is what we're
exactly. I mean, I don't know, I guess it's like one of the things that sort of I think about a lot is how, so there's the central character Sylvia, who gets kicked off the show as an actor, well, she was meant to be an extra, but Truman ended up falling in love with her, and they had sort of like but she gets kicked off the show for like almost revealing it to him. But I guess like also partially one of the reasons that they sort of like removed her was because there was a scripted sort of following that Truman was meant to have. It's not even really like whether it was like, okay, he was in a dome where he was being filmed all the time, but within that environment he had free will. He really didn't even have the free will to pick, you know, who his wife was or who he fell in love with.
I was trying to kind of think into the sort of detail of that, because I mean, there's obviously the sort of, you know, they could, I suppose, if we think about, you know, they could have played this out where he did get to choose, and then they contracted that person to be, you know, the love interest or whatever. But
it was already sort
you know,
of
it's obviously already
yeah.
decided, you know, that that Meryl is going to be the wife, and then when she leaves him, it's like, you know, we're going to introduce another love interest, and there's that really horrible kind of forced flirtation scene in the office with the new woman who's going to be working next door to him. And I think there's something there, isn't there, about the kind of like, although they think that Truman is real, you know, he's the only kind of like, you know, non-actor and so on, but he's actually this, like, they treat him like a character and say this character needs to have this kind of wife so that we get this kind of outcome. So I mean, there's a real sort of failure, I think, deliberately for us to consider with this idea of kind of distinguishing what is real as what is simulated. And I was thinking, you know, it's obviously like Truman is one thing, but if you think about Marlon, he's like supposed to be like friends with Truman from childhood, right? So how different, like how, and also for being Truman's wife, you know, like what, she gets sort of time off when she's in the hospital, but the rest of the time it's not like
24/7. That's it. Yeah,
exactly. So when doesn't, like, you know, there's a really interesting sort of blurring there, which again, you know, I think going back to what you're saying about like assuming things are real when we see them on television and we're told, you know, this is a real story or whatever, and this question of how much of it is filtered through the camera choices, you know, and the scenarios that are set up and that sort of thing, which is obviously a big part of this. And it made me think a little bit, before we move on to kind of the setting, about like, so Truman is only like, this show surely would only be a success because Truman turns out to be the sort of person that he turns out to be.
Yes.
And I wondered whether we think that that's because they were lucky, the baby that happened to be born on the right time for the launch date and so on, was like, turned out to be the right kind of character, or how much of it we think that because he's been treated like the star of the show as a performer since birth, he has risen to turn into that person.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. It's kind of that question of like nature and nurture, really. But I mean, I think surely, you know, it's his exposure and the way he's treated. But it's also interesting, you know, I'm sure we'll talk more about probably, you know, what happens, you know, after the film's ending. You know, we really only see him sort of walk out the exit door of this of Seahaven, and you know, it kind of leaves, you know, your own interpretation. I think the director or someone says how it allows for, you know, a sort of a continuation expansion of the story, stays with you, you know, outside, you know, outside of the film in the sort of viewer's mind. But like how he therefore deals with his fame that he didn't even know he had. It's not this like sort of gradual sprung, you know, worldwide knowledge of him and his fame and stuff. It's just how would he go about dealing with that, because everyone knows him. I think it's said sort of like, you know, millions of people view it all the time, every day. But I guess it's not necessarily something that doesn't happen like in the modern world as well. You know, with the internet, you know, you can become well known within like minutes. You know, sort of just how quickly
that is true
for
sort of
which I guess is
bad.
different from the 90s when the film was released. But I don't know.
Yeah, that is a good point. I guess our idea of celebrity was much more like focused in, I guess, you know, you had two sorts of celebrities. The ones who, you know, you'd actually like, they'd done something like write a book or something like that, and so we're famous for that. And then the ones who are essentially kind of famous for being famous, because it's just that beginning, I think, of that idea of celebrity, that really started to grow during the 90s. With people who maybe they were models, but then they kind of became sort of like lifestyle icons, or just kind of the focus of the, if we're talking about the high point in terms of the paparazzi and things like that. Obviously, after sort of Leveson and so on, there has been some perhaps change in that, but overall, this is a time when if you were famous, then, or you were made famous by the media, then you were kind of hounded for it. And you're right, I think there is something quite, we'll talk about the ending a bit later, but there is something powerful about the idea that Peter Weir, the director, kind of likes these sort of hanging endings where we do get to sort of just not know what happens to Truman. The point is the going on into the next step of that story. Yeah, I mean, maybe this is a good opportunity to talk about kind of, when we think about what shaped Truman, some of the ethics of how they make him the person that he is, because that's one of the hardest things, I think, for us to deal with, right? The how they keep him on the island.
Well, yeah, point blank, completely unethical, against Truman's will and everything. But yeah, I guess so. There's obviously times in this show where the sort of, I guess, some of the, I guess, the setup sort of peels away and that's like reality comes through. I think there's the sort of initial scene where a light fixture drops out of the sky, and Truman's like, what's just happened? And they kind of try, Christof tries to fabricate explanations for sort of these logical explanations, and in that case specifically saying that it was sort of a passing over aircraft that was sort of losing bits of its sort of framework or whatnot.
On the one hand, there's the risk of reality breaking in, like you said, with the lamp falling out of the sky, but there's also the sort of way in which that reality has to be maintained and the costliness of doing that. And there's a real sense, I think, with the sort of the ethics of it. I don't know where my bit on ethics has gone. I've sort of chopped it out of the notes somewhere along the way. Anyway, but the idea of him having to create this fear of dogs, because then dogs can be used to constrain him from taking certain paths, and most traumatic of all, this idea of making him afraid of water by not only killing off, in inverted commas, his father in the boating accident, but the implied sort of sense of responsibility that Truman holds, because he was the one who wanted to go further and risk the storm and so on when he was a little boy. And it comes down to this idea, I suppose, of the costliness of this utopia. Christof particularly is very, there it is, ethics maintaining Truman's life, trauma as the price of utopia. See, that's a great line there. But yeah, fitting in with this idea that Christof claims that this sort of utopia is worthwhile, whatever kind of the cost of doing that. And it brings us nicely into I think this theme of surveillance, because we talk a lot, and we'll come back to ideas around liberty later on, but what we accept in society a certain level of policing, of constraint on our liberty, as part of the social contract, so that in return we get safety. And I suppose the question really comes down to like, how much is it acceptable to surveil, to constrain people in order to keep their kind of perfect life? Now, this is obviously like a really extreme example of that, but is there any world like in which, I suppose, I mean, like, to have a really good life where everything was safe and everything was paid for and so on, would you knowingly accept cameras on every single surface of your world? That, I suppose, is the question that Truman doesn't have that choice, but Christof kind of claims that he does, because he says we could leave at any time, he just chooses not to. Now we see that that's not in fact the case, but what do we think about its commentary, I suppose, on surveillance and the acceptability of that?
Yeah, I guess it's the question of, you know, you're given everything that's sort of perfect. You know, I guess so. Truman's sort of setting isn't the more like, you know, America's sort of 50s American dream sort of style. Yeah, I mean, you know, you're giving up your privacy and what's the word? You know, and you've got your own. I don't know. This was my brain's not working
like
today, Claire. I'm really
autonomy or
struggling.
something like
That's the
that.
one.
Yeah,
The autonomy.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that it's a really interesting reflection to think of what you say about the kind of 1950s aesthetic, right? Whereas of course the 1950s, okay, we're not talking about a surveillance culture in the sense of the increasing ubiquity of cameras, but there's an interesting article on surveillance in Dark City, which is a film we haven't done yet, but perhaps we should do, and the Truman Show. This is by Alex Fitt, and he really explores this idea of the way in which this sort of 50s aesthetic and some of the sort of references in the film make us think of this idea of surveillance in terms of the kind of communist witch hunts of the 1950s. Interesting, we were talking about Oppenheimer last week, which of course, you know, that's a really good exemplification of that. And the idea that like everyone was afraid that your neighbors might secretly be, you know, communists and so on. So it's like Truman is in this sort of same sort of situation where he thinks that all the people around him are his real friends, his real family, his real neighbors, but actually they are all A, surveilling him, and B, not what they seem to be, you know. So there's something really sort of sinister about that. And I have to say, I had not fully considered the implications of Truman's name, but the sort of the idea of him as the true man, sort of an idealized man, was one thing, but also the fact that it makes us think of Harry Truman, the president, who was president into the early 1950s. So it kind of picks up that aesthetic. And also, and this I didn't know, the surname Burbank references the city Burbank in Los Angeles, which is like the media capital of the world. So it's like a parallel with this idea of kind of like the influence of media and Hollywood and so on. Picks up a little bit as well by the fact that like that's like Truman's name does one thing, but Marlon's name makes us think of like Marlon Brando, and Meryl's name makes us think of like Meryl Streep. These are like Hollywood names, which Truman is not in the same way. So some interesting kind of like little bits of clue there. Let's think about that utopia then, because obviously like we said that, you know, it's paid for with this kind of price of both the surveillance but also the trauma that is inflicted on him in order to kind of keep him safely there. Right down to stuff like when he's a little boy and he wants to do his stand-ups and he wants to be an explorer, and they're like, oh no, there's nothing left to explore. So like dashing the hopes of this child. I find that really hard as like an educator watching that scene. But like, what kind of place did you think that Seahaven was? It's obviously presented to us as a utopia. I find it like not just because we know that it's fake, but like in other ways really dystopian. But what do you think about that sort of like small town America sort of depiction?
I mean, you know, I feel like as though Truman's lifestyle is sort of corporate man who's, you know, selling insurance to people, goes to his office every day, comes back to his wife to dinner and, you know, to TV in the evening. And you know, and it's sort of his neighbors and stuff. I think there was a you know, we're going through the notes and stuff, and it is depicted as that sort of like white heterosexual, you know, perfect America that, you know, people in quotation marks perfect, that people consider. So again, his life is like in the vision of, I guess, you know, Christof and the crew that run it. And in a way, I don't know if we were sort of discussing this like before at the beginning, the concept of why people would watch reality TV, and in a some essence to sort of see, oh, my life is sort of better than this person's. But I guess for Truman, and maybe the goal of like
Yeah,
the people that run his show is that the opposite way
it's
around,
opposite
to
of
be
that,
like,
isn't it?
this is the ideal.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree with you there. They're really trying to sell this as a sort of a perfect idealized sort of environment. And I guess that does two things. I mean, one, of course, it's sort of as you say, it has this sort of agenda beneath it of sort of saying, this place is superior because it conforms to these particular traditional values. The stuff that is I think they mentioned that apart from the fact that they always show Truman films that are like home is best and so on, you don't have to go anywhere, but also like they show things like I Love Lucy, for example, which like ran through the 50s, and these are very kind of like these classic kind of clean living American sitcoms and so on. And just there's so many things where you think like, as it Marlon says to Truman, you've got a desk job. I would love to have a desk job, and this sort of complete, almost like gaslighting in a way, into sort of thinking that his unhappiness is not a justified unhappiness. And it made me think like, what would have happened if Truman had actually been gay? Like once he grew up, what if he wasn't this sort of,
just straight man,
heterosexual ideal man that they wanted him to
How
be?
would they even go around stopping that? I don't know. It's obviously he also doesn't have the privacy at all, so it would have
Yeah,
been
yeah, exactly. And I just think that it plays into this idea, which, yes, we should hope that it's changing, but the idea that basically society still tries to kind of close down difference. And I kind of felt like, just like it wasn't acceptable for him to fall in love with the wrong woman, presumably any other proclivities would have been overridden in favor of, this is the ideal wife. Look, here is Meryl, and this is what your life is going to look like. And I thought it was tied into again with this sort of constant reiteration of the idea of them having a baby, that's the only thing that is kind of acceptable as the next step in their lives, partly because Christof wants the first ever on-screen conception, and partly because I think that's this sort of model ideal, right? So what, they're supposed to have 2.4 kids. The other thing, though, that of course is about the idealizing, which is a beautiful segue, you're going to enjoy this, is towards the advertising element of the show. It's got to be an idealized world, right? Because you want the products
to exist in this
to be
perfect,
aspirational, and
exactly,
everyone to pick up the catalogue. It's obviously one of the very funny elements of the film, but again, like, creepy, considering I think that I was thinking about what you were saying about the internet, and now we are like literally like consuming advertising all the time as the cost of everything we do.
Like, I think what I've said before in the show, that it's something like we see 5,000 adverts a day. I think it is more than that.
We had this statistic. I'm gonna have to grab the book because it was mentioned, or a statistic to that effect is mentioned in
10,000 adverts apparently. What does the book say, Claire?
What does the book say? The book says, here is it where it's bookmarked. So this is about the time that the film was made. At that point, the average consumer sees somewhere between 1,500 and 3,000 commercial messages a day, and that's bearing in mind that this is going back to kind of the sort of late 90s, early noughties, I think, for when that was. So it would only be considerably increased now. But I mean, this idea that we're kind of like constantly told what an idealized life would be. We might laugh at Meryl holding up a pot of cocoa, or was it the way that every morning Truman is slammed against a billboard so that it gets full on shot while he has a conversation. But how different is it really from like what we experience now?
I mean, I think there's just a bit of at the moment, especially a dialogue about where does the advertising stop. And I don't know. I think we're reaching sort of weird post-capitalism state, but everyone's sort of struggling to continue that like exponential growth sort of model, and especially like I think something I've been thinking about a lot is sort of subscription services, especially for streaming, such as Netflix and Hulu, etc. There's a million out there now, which are like all consistently competing with each other. But with I think Amazon is getting sued because Amazon Prime, people who pay for Amazon Prime are getting unskippable adverts on.
Yeah, that's right.
The
So they have started,
Yeah.
and Netflix is doing the same thing. I'm now paying more for both because I don't want to watch ads.
Yeah.
And like now, if you have a Now TV subscription, that has ads on it, even though it's a paid subscription. And it does feel like, just like something is failing in the model. Obviously, there. And I do question how much all this advertising has any impact on people. I guess it has some sort of a subconscious thing where you're like, oh, I need to buy a new vacuum cleaner, and like somewhere in the back of your head, some kind of like Vax or Dyson or Hoover. The Hoovers vacuum cleaners are available. We should say, but it's something we talked about. A lot of podcasts have advertising to make their revenue, and mostly I have a few podcasts that I subscribe to, but mostly I listen to adverts or skip over adverts all the time, and I really dislike it, but it's a long time model of how these things are done, which we are still resisting, dear listeners. So please find our Coffee link and allow us to continue not putting adverts on your in the middle of your show here. But one of the things I think that is really uncomfortable about it is this kind of like, again, it feels like a sort of gaslighting or potential gaslighting of the viewer, sort of saying, if your life is not like this, it's you haven't made it yet, you haven't stepped into kind of like the privileged life of Truman, which of course is then undermined, I guess, by the narrative of the film as he starts to kind of step away from that. And it certainly, for me, left me thinking, we'll talk about the metaphorical kind of elements of liberty towards the end of the show, but there is a parallel, all the time with kind of like, what is it that we give up in order to have this sort of, not just a sort of safe life, but a life that kind of conforms to these ongoing, as you say, kind of like capitalist consumerist standards, which it's we use our search engines, and then we release all our data to Google or whatever. It's the same kind of arguments, really. If I shop somewhere, then that triggers future kind of suggestions to me, so that I can continue to sort of shop and be a consumer in the same way.
I mean, I think there's that sort of, at the moment, this like idea of nothing, if you're not getting advertised to, if you're not getting adverts popping up at you and something's considered free, it's not really free, you're just selling information about yourself. So I don't know, which I guess is kind of like, I guess this sort of change in
it's obviously interesting with the rise of people using ad blockers, and I don't know a great deal about this, but obviously the more this sort of technology becomes available, it's going to impact on the stuff that is, as you say, free in inverted commas. And again, a sort of a whole kind of like revenue model combating all of that, which
I guess my curiosity about ad blockers, in the sort of, there's a website that has loads of pop-ups and stuff, you've got your ad blocker on, is there a way to really sort of assess whether these adverts are actually being seen, or like whether they're coming up to people, the traffic that comes onto said website? Because at the end of the day, if a company's receiving a payment from someone else to advertise their new Hoover, for example,
is it still coming up as there, but we're not seeing it?
We're just not seeing it. So I don't know.
So there's I think a lot of things here that feel kind of a little bit prophetic for the direction in which stuff has gone. I mean, it's a sort of, obviously, like a slightly near future kind of idea of the sort of technology they have in the the Truman Show, as it were. The fact that they're able to use these kind of very small cameras, the idea they're able to build this studio world on such a scale is kind of like, you know, a little bit sci-fi-ish, but everything else, of course, is not. So it does feel like it's sort of foreseen directions in which a lot of stuff goes. So we've talked a bit about how Truman kind of like is the Sirius, the brightest of the stars, falls out of the sky, and he first starts to notice things strange, continuing to this idea of his claim that everybody is watching him. I really like the way in which they develop this through the sort of when he goes into, you know, he tries to test his ability to stop traffic. He tries to go into a building that he's never been into before, that obviously is not in fact a functioning business because the kind of offset is behind the elevator shaft. All of these things are kind of very cleverly done. But it also, of course, like has this really uncomfortable element to it, especially in how things go with his relationship with his wife, and also when like Marlon, who is always sent in with a 6-pack of brewskis, is there to tell him everything is real, and it leads to some really uncomfortable scenes, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, what did you think, I suppose, about those two relationships, about like the relationship, like the best friend and the wife?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a sort of scene with Truman and Meryl where they kind of get into a bit of an altercation where I think Truman comes back home and is trying to express, you know, his sort of doubts about reality, and gosh, what does he ask in the scene? Does he even ask her if she loves him or something?
Yeah,
I
it's
actually can't
after
quite
he's
remember.
seen the fact that she's crossing her fingers in the wedding photo, and
Oh,
so
okay.
you know, it's the things that have gone on during that day, and obviously it's also within the kind of, you know, ways in which he's testing it. So when he does the you know, you can watch and you can see that it's, what is it, red bicycle, man with flowers, yellow beetle with dented fender, and they're just going round and round.
Yeah. Almost kind of
And
like a
obviously
Groundhog Day kind
the
of thing.
again, the really kind of traumatic bit where they try to he tries to drive out of Seahaven, basically tricking the kind of false traffic jams that are stopping him, until he's eventually basically like circled by masked people in hazard and hazmat suits, and kind of like driven to the ground and then sent home again. So all of that, I think, is in the background. But yeah, you know, it kind of culminates in the one person, I suppose, that, you know, he really should be able to trust, who he now realizes, like he says, you know, why are you married to me if you know, you can't stand me? This kind of realization. It's really sad, but there is something quite problematic about what it drives him to.
I mean, so there's a sort of domestic abuse element to it a bit, which is uncomfortable with, you know, and it's like uncomfortable to watch because you can obviously see he's a man in distress, and it's like everyone obviously, you know, is never okay in any situation too.
No, but you do understand the circumstances, don't you? And it's very, I mean, you know, much as you know, I'm with you, I feel very uncomfortable with it. You can't feel a huge amount of sympathy
for him, and especially the way that his like wife distances herself from what he's trying to bring up to her, and I think straight away goes into like sort of an advert segment, and he's like, what is going on? Who are you speaking to? You know? It's just it's difficult.
And obviously, you know, it's a sort of, there's a dark humor to that whole thing, both in the way that she's gaslighting him, the way that he reacts to her to try and you know, well, it's violent because I suppose, you know, he is bigger and stronger than her. She does first reach for the, what is it, the 3-in-1 dice sub peeler. So but you know, so there's kind of humor there, and then of course Marlon's sent in with his beers, whatever. But it's the moment when Meryl breaks the fourth wall.
She asks for help from sort of, you know,
she does,
to Truman, you know, it's just into the surrounding, you know, room, but it's for like from the crew and stuff. She's asking someone to help her.
Yeah.
And it, yeah, you know,
And
sort of
finally
elevates
says,
that
you know,
value.
how can I be expected to work in these conditions? It's not professional, which of course reduces, I guess, everything that Truman has, you know, the fact that this is a marriage for him and so on,
and for her it's
into
like
that.
a you know, a work, you know,
Yeah.
yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, but that's exactly that. It's like, how are these people, for example, like Truman's wife, expected to show up, be there 24/7 like that? Is that work, or is that your just new lifestyle?
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah.
Which, you know, it has an uncomfortable element on kind of like, I guess, the way in which fame and success potentially does force you to remain in something that is ultimately kind of damaging to you. You know, how, you know, I suppose if somebody wanted to end their contracts, then, you know, they could kill off the character or whatever. But it's still
bloody traumatic for
yeah,
Truman,
exactly.
Jesus
You know, it
Christ.
just causes more trauma for Truman and for, like, yeah, you know, it's a really difficult kind of concept, I suppose. And I suppose all of this is like the fiction of how could you maintain this for 30 years, but they certainly make it feel very plausible, I reckon.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think for me, the worst scene in this respect is definitely when Marlon is having this heart-to-heart with Truman about, you know, how he's feeling about things, and you realise the lines are being fed to him by Christof. And I love the fact they have, like, well, I suppose they have to have like a live musician 24 hours who's improvising in response to the scenes that are taking place. And when you get like the reunion with the father, and it's like, and then up the heartfelt music and add your strings now.
Is the music being played in the, like, is it something that
in
Truman
the studio? There's
hears?
somebody at the piano like 24/7. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. That's, I mean, I honestly think that scene where I think they're on the beach and Truman having this conversation, and I think Truman, there's the quote where he goes, "Well, I don't know what to think, Marlon. Maybe I'm losing my mind, but it's like the whole world revolves around me somehow," which is just really hilarious. Writing,
it's great, you know, the way that the dramatic irony works for the viewer of the film, and then we're also, of course, know that it's working for the viewers of the TV show as well. But one of the things that, you know, we'll come back to sort of like how you know, this question of how's it going to end, but I think that there is this real disparity that we should probably concede between what Christof claims the interest in reality TV is and what it seems the actual viewers think the purpose of the Truman Show is. So I think, you know, Christof sees it as this source of comfort to people, a way of living their lives kind of, you know, vicariously through Truman. And yet what we see is the fact that the favorite moments are when the fourth wall is challenged, basically when it looks like reality is going to slip in. And I wonder whether that is also a reflection, you know, kind of on sort of reality TV shows. Do we really want things to sort of go wrong for people within them? But for Truman, of course, that could be a sort of step towards it going right, that actually everybody believes that Truman is in a prison and that they want him eventually to leave, but they collude within that prison by being viewers of the show.
Yeah, exactly.
Which again is a very uncomfortable sort of thing on the way that which, you know, we might sort of know something is wrong, and yet contribute to it anyway, you know. And yeah, hold my hands up, you know, we were just talking about you know, Amazon Prime and so on. Know that, you know, Amazon is a sort of devil, but they still use Amazon. And I mean, not everybody. I have done, you know, not used it in the past, but particularly as a like, as I've become increasingly unable to leave my house because of my illness, you know,
there are some things
it just makes me go, you know, I don't have an alternative to this. So I try to put limits on that. But you know, so we sort of say, well, yeah, for the convenience or whatever, we'll just forget the unconscionable kind of working environment and tax situation and so on, and just kind of, you know, step outside it. So yeah, an interesting parallel there. We have talked quite a bit about Christof in the abstract. Shall we go into Christof in a little bit more depth? Because I find him, again, obviously we've got all our kind of like feelings, I suppose, of are on the one hand directed towards Truman, but as viewers of the film, we see much more of Christof than viewers of the television show would. So we see that
Yes,
kind of hand of
definitely.
God in a way that they only see the kind of outworkings of it.
Yeah.
So what do you think about Christof? What is he trying to
I
like
mean, yeah, he's
do?
obviously sort of seen as this obviously kind of in Truman's world, omnipotent kind of godlike figure.
Mm.
And he's kind of been appointed as like, I don't know, he's almost painted as it's interesting. I think there's a lot of rhetoric, especially in the sort of different essays that have been, written about it, about the Truman Show, saying how he's, there's this juxtaposition of him and the company
Mhm.
that runs the show, almost
Yep.
kind of being these saviors of Truman, who was, this unwanted baby.
Mm.
They legally adopted him and saved him and gave him this sort of almost
Even the
a version
idea
of
of
a
that
better
kind of
life.
corporate adoption is
Yeah,
pretty terrible, isn't it?
is pretty terrible, and it seems like it's a sort of dystopian idea to us, but probably could
Mm.
happen. Probably, I
Yeah.
wouldn't
Do you
put it
know,
past being
there's a currently on ITV, I've just watched the spin-off kind of sequel show to Orphan Black, which is one of the greatest science fiction shows of all time. But there's a show called Orphan Black Echoes, which is like following the characters, but later on in a different sort of story. And it raises ideas around kind of like not quite corporate adoption, but something very similar to that. The idea of kind of like the value of taking a child and using it from birth. I won't spoil it for people, but it's definitely kind of one of the themes there. So it might be an interesting one to see how that develops as a dystopian theme and where else we
yeah.
might find it. So yeah, it sort of reduces a child to a product.
Yes,
And
yeah,
that's what Truman
exactly.
is.
Yeah, but obviously, is also kind of I guess is like, the idea of almost like a warden, and
Mhm.
Truman's the prisoner. I think
Yeah.
a lot of there's the references to what's that prison called with the
Oh, the panopticon. Yeah, this is a
well,
good parallel. I'll say this was the idea by the philosopher Jeremy Bentham of this sort of ideal prison where you could basically have one guard in a central glass tower, so the guard would see everything without ever being seen, and so essentially every prisoner would be watched because no prisoner would ever know whether they were being watched at that particular time. So there is this question really, I suppose, whether like it quite works, I suppose, because Truman doesn't know he's being watched at all, or he has a sense that he is being watched because something makes him aware of it. But there are nonetheless, I think, like parallels there. And obviously, like there's a really neat parallel with this idea of the moon, because that's like the panoptic tower, and up Christof is in his little moon
yeah, I think it's called the
bubble,
lunar room or something like
something
that
like that,
in
isn't it? It's got
the,
some sort
yeah,
of
where there's this
sinister
sort of
sinister
control
name.
boards. Yeah.
Yeah.
To kind of go with the play on words, especially with names,
Mm,
Truman and True Man.
mm.
I think I read somewhere about Christof kind of, there being sort of almost like religious
Yeah.
ties with the ideas
Yeah.
of him being a savior and this God figure, but also,
Yeah.
Christof, Christ of. Um, and there's
Yeah,
also
within
another
this
like,
world, he is the God
yeah,
figure,
he is the God
and he has,
figure.
he has an increasing God complex, doesn't he? Because
Yes,
ultimately,
for sure.
his desire for control over what Truman does, it leads to him being willing for Truman to die. Because
Die,
he says,
yeah,
he was
rather
born on
than escape.
television, to
Yeah,
die on television.
exactly. And yeah, I mean, there's weirdly a lot of like I'd say some like religious imagery every now and then, especially towards the end where Truman sort of walks towards the exit. He like walks across, to these steps,
across the
almost
water,
like walk across the water, sort of,
which makes him
Christ-like.
the kind of son of God figure to kind of Christof as God, but then the sort of separation of them, that they're not actually what Christof believes that they are to one another. And and there is obviously like this sort of, I think Truman feels very uncomfortable with this idea that he is kind of like the center of attention. But one of the sort of claims that's been made is that he has some, like, he may not be able to articulate it until things start going wrong and it becomes obvious. But like, even down to the way in which he performs within his bathroom, and like performs in front of the bathroom mirror, or he has a catchphrase each morning with the kind of good afternoon, good evening, and good night slogan, that he's just a normal bloke, right? But somehow he's created a slogan for himself. It's
like very marketable,
kind of... exactly. So this sort of, as you say, this like nurture situation has really created this. And if we take that kind of like God idea, then obviously the utopia that Christof has created, Seahaven, becomes Eden. And we have this idea of like the Garden of Eden as the perfect world, but actually the sort of actual kind of reality of sort of humanity takes place outside of Eden. It's when Adam and Eve have fallen and been cast out of the garden that the real story of human history begins. So it's one way of looking at obviously the Eden story, even though it's supposed to be paradise and somewhere that you wouldn't want to leave, is that if you're not making that choice, if you are trapped, then it's not paradise until you've decided whether you want to choose the opposite. Which is one, I suppose, interpretation of the kind of eating of the apple in the Genesis myth. So there's something really interesting, I think, going on like playing there. The other thing I thought about Christof particularly is his misunderstanding of love. That is really, is it the slogan on the t-shirts that the staff wear? Is it like love him, protect him?
Yes.
And we get like Christof in the night stroking Truman's enormous green cam sleeping face, and this idea that you could mistake for love something that is control, or you could mistake for protection something that is manipulation. I mean, obviously we do it with children to some extent. We don't I suppose expose them to truths that they're not ready for because it protects them. But Truman is not a child, although he is depicted somewhat as a child in some places. I mean, did you think that they sort of like he was reduced to childishness in certain ways?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it kind of comes with his like lack of, it's I think it's the idea of like everyone else knows something that he doesn't. Sort of naivety to like what the reality is.
You're talking about his naivety, and I think, well, I mean, he obviously is naive in the sense that he literally doesn't have kind of the available knowledge to be able to kind of like pass sophisticated judgments. There's also something about the sort of I mean, there's partly some of the ways that they clothe him, I think. So he, on the one hand, he's obviously kind of like, there's got a lot of corporate clothing and things like that, but he also wears stuff that's quite sort of brightly coloured and patterned. We have him in his red little boy like shorts when he's doing the gardening. But there's also his like secrets in the basement, which feels like the playroom into which he hides away, and keeps the toys and keeps the reminders, keeps Sylvia's card again, the things that he needs to keep private, but also which remind us a little bit of kind of a child's playroom. And obviously when he makes his strategic escape up through the hole that he's made in the lawn, he kind of like leaves behind toys to take his place, and it's almost like he steps out into an adult world. There's an interesting parallel in his clothing in those final scenes, because he's actually wearing like dark clothing, not the kind of like brightly colored stuff. It's stuff that he looks a lot more adult than perhaps he does in other parts of the film, where he's either kind of like childlike, or he's dressed up to play a part, whereas he looks much more kind of ordinary towards the end. So that I thought was, kind of like an interesting thing, this idea of there is a kind of like a growing up process. And again, one of the things that I think that some both philosophers that have gone beyond God, or people who have gone from kind of like a very simplistic idea of maybe Christian religion into a kind of more nuanced idea of it, is it's like a pathway of growing up, either growing out of God or growing into a more kind of like sophisticated idea of God. That we sort of see being mentioned. Was another parallel in the that Peter Weir interview that you mentioned earlier that I liked here, which was that seeing Christof in the sense that as the creator, an artist creating the true man, he is like a Dr. Frankenstein. So he becomes, again, the creator becomes the monster, and so on there. And this idea that, again, like I thought, this idea of an artist, and what does that mean? Well, it means like sculpting the person into what you want them to be. And of course, again, creator and so on has the God parallels there as well. So what do we think then about, before we get on to kind of some metaphor stuff, just to finish off, what do we think about the ending of the film?
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, Peter Weir sort of talks about how it is a bit of a cliffhanger to be able to kind of open up, the own sort of viewer's mind to what kind of happens continuously after. And it, as Truman sort of walks towards the door, Christof comes over the huge intercom in the globe. Which is interesting that that's a feature in the globe anyway. That's
the fact that he can kind of like broadcast into the I suppose they play noises like the thunder and things like that, don't they? So I guess they have got that capability. But yeah, it's like it's proper, and the voice from heaven kind of stuff, isn't it? And of course, it's also we should parallel it with 1984 as well, and the idea of kind of like Big Brother and that sort of overall control that, like, even you don't actually need the person there because Big Brother is always watching. And we learn that obviously Big Brother is like a created ideal in 1984, but we definitely see Christof is like it breaks kind of his own rules there at the end to engage with Truman. And yeah, I mean, what's the quote of what he actually says there?
Oh, here we go. Who are you? Truman says. Christof goes on to say, I am the creator of a television show that gives hope and joy and inspiration to millions. And Truman says, who am I? You're the star. Was nothing real? And Christof says, you were real. That's what made you so good to watch. Listen to me, Truman. There's no more truth out there than there is in the world I created for you. Same lies, the same deceit, but in my world, you have nothing to fear. I know you better than you know yourself, which is, that again, sort of that creator and creation. But even I think sort of going with what you were saying about art as well, as no matter how, like, whatever you create, like, the sort of art or the thing that you make yourself, once you sort of release it out there into the world, it can take on a life of its own. You can't control the way that people interpret that or sort of perceive it once it's been. And I think in the same sort of sense, Christof has this notion of like, oh, I am your maker, and therefore I will always know you better than yourself. But once Christof has sort of like
needs to learn about death of the author.
Exactly, death of the author.
That's a really, really interesting thought, actually. I mean, one of the things that I think really kind of proves that point is the fact that, as you said, Christof has this one idea about what the show is, and then the viewers respond in a very different way. We know that there's been this kind of movement that Sylvia is obviously a big part of, that you can see all the posters in her flat that are like Truman behind bars, and sort of the campaigns to free Truman and that sort of thing. But we also know that the majority are just watching and going along with it. But they all want him to get out. There's nobody that we see who seems to conform to this idea. Even the people in like the Truman bar, whose livelihoods essentially depend we assume on the existence of the Truman Show, these are still people who want to see him escape. And there's that very telling bit where it's the security guards who obviously like fill their time watching the Truman Show when they're on duty, and then they're just like, what else is on? It's over, fine, gave a bit of a cheer, and now we'll just find something else. Like nothing is, especially in kind of like the mind of the artist might think it's terribly important, but actually the recipient, however much they love it, it's minor in comparison with the issues of the real world. And Christof's sort of idea that basically the real world and Seahaven are the same, it's just that Seahaven is safe. I mean, it's a very negative kind of view of the world, but it does raise some interesting questions, I suppose, again over this thing about all worlds are dangerous, people always lie, you're always at risk, but you can basically sort of give up everything that kind of gives you freedom to be safe. But ultimately that is not what Truman chooses to do. And of course although Christof claims, and this is in the telephone interview, the interview where he takes telephone calls from the public, and Sylvia rings in, and Christof argues that Truman, he can leave at any time. What distresses you really, caller, is that ultimately Truman prefers his cell, as you call it. And we've talked already about this idea, how can you escape a prison if you don't know that you are in a prison? But for the sort of our purposes, it also raises questions that we've talked about before, that I thought of, like the way in which we are constrained in prisons, both of our own making and of the making of those who are around us, all together in society. So, how we are seen by others itself puts constraints on us. But also things that are artificial in a sense, obviously very artificial in Seahaven, but like artificial in the real world, like our upbringing. It's like a construct around us, but it profoundly affects kind of like who we are, our social environment, our education, or indoctrination, perhaps in Truman's case, the media that we consume. All of those basically shape us to think in certain ways, and we've got to kind of look beyond those and challenge those at risk to ourselves, because it's usually putting yourself beyond your comfort zone, to sort of say, I'm going to think differently from the people around me, or I'm not going to conform to certain expectations of me from parents, from peers, from teachers, from society in general, for your class or your background or whatever it might be. All of these things could be seen as like the cell that is created for us, that we don't see as a cell necessarily, but can definitely put limitations on kind of our experience of life in the world. And I won't go too much into it, but in Slavoj Žižek's chapter, Welcome to the Desert of the Real, in his Cultures of Fear, he used the Truman Show as specifically a commentary on the idea of the late capitalist consumerist Californian paradise, and the way in which that's kind of hyper-realized within the Truman Show. But again, this idea that we are constrained within that kind of view of the world is one that I think is actually really interesting at the moment. This idea that like capitalism is the only way in which the world can exist. You can't imagine anything else, even though it's relatively new in human history, that people can't foresee another way forward. Well, actually, like Truman proving that the world is a construct is a metaphor in a way for us saying, everything we do is a construct, so there are other ways of doing it. Now, I know that you are going to roll your eyes if I start talking about Descartes and stuff, but I think this is like just to pick up on that sort of thing. I'll put in the show notes, but there's a particularly interesting article in Christopher Falzon's book, what was it, Existentialism and Contemporary Cinema, a Sartrean Perspective. And I don't want to talk too much about Sartre, not least because it's out of my real sort of area of comfort, but I did think that there was a really interesting parallel here. This is this idea that basically with Sartre, his ideas around self-determination lay in the rejection of the concept of God, first of all, And then secondly, the rejection of social rules and constraints to give our life framework. So either the idea that God is providing purpose and direction in your life, or that society is constraining you within certain ideas of direction, have to be rejected in order to create self-determination. And this comes up in a number of Peter Weir's films, but in the Truman Show particularly, we get this idea that the kind of affirmation that Truman lacks is only achieved in any sense by the point at which he decides that he can determine the meaning and direction of his life. He's in this constraining and repressive social situation, but he is also subject to this God figure, Christof, even if he doesn't know it. I suppose he has to make that actual point of rejection, the one in which he doesn't do what Christof says. And I also thought it was interesting, he has to take this great risk because we know what's beyond the door, but he doesn't know what's beyond the door. So this idea, I think, of sort of saying that ultimately external determination is something that we should reject for the way in which it constrains us if we want to commit to the proper idea of kind of liberty and individual freedom. And that fits a little bit with something else which Truman says, which is this idea that like Christof never knew what was inside his head. So this idea of sense of self, and again this is talked about by Peter Marks in his book Imagining Surveillance, Utopian and Dystopian Literature and Film. He's talking about identity, and he asks this question, like, who is the Truman who leaves? Because he basically says, you know, by declaring his personal independence, that Christof does not know him. He could never see inside his brain. And there's a quotation in this book by Marx from a neuroscientist called Susan Greenfield, who argues that the brain gives you that unique consciousness that no one else can hack into, and on top of that, a self-consciousness and continuing experience of your own special identity. So the brain, therefore, is the locus of identity, and so Truman can never actually be known, in spite of the fact that he is watched and controlled and so on. He is still something inside his own head, which is inviolable, which is the same argument that was made in 1984, where like the state, the thought police, can't actually get inside your head. Although I suppose that's something that 1984 does challenge, Orwell does challenge in that as well. That
concept kind of like comes up again in our previous episode, The Three-Body Problem, yes. When, you know, at the end of the series,
the wall faces,
the wall faces, you know, are enlisted to come up with a plan to save humanity within their own minds, which is the only sort of place where, you know, they can't be surveyed by the Trisolarians, I guess.
Yes. Things that are whizzing around the actions
Santi, that's the one.
The Santi. Yes. That's right. So there's this idea of this concept that however like much you are constrained by the things around you, there is this idea around freedom. Now, we also talk a lot on this podcast about the idea of kind of the importance of I suppose not going down a libertarian route where it's basically entirely about yourself, you know, your own liberty to keep every penny you make and not pay taxes or carry a gun and all those sorts of things which are one end of libertarianism. But I don't think that this is kind of going down that road. It's basically saying you can be yourself within your community, but also that this idea of kind of self-awareness is actually, that's what liberty really is. It's self-awareness. It's knowing kind of how you fit within the world around you, but that does mean kind of opening your mind to not going down the road that, you know, the world is controlled by some sort of evil cabal, although we have had evil cabals. We had that in Leave the World Behind. It's a good one. But that idea that kind of like your self-awareness and your ability to situate yourself within the world and become aware of your surroundings is an important step towards a type of freedom that is metaphorically shown in Truman's path. And we also see this argument that it's really, really worth pursuing, even if you nearly die, you abandon everything you step into the unknown. That sense of liberty is nonetheless to be pursued. So yeah, okay, well, that got a bit deep, didn't it? Philosophers, write in, tell us where we got it all wrong, because I'm reasonable on philosophy, but it did get a bit deep in some
I was
of the reading.
completely out of my depth. I'm just sat here listening to Claire. Just it's good.
Well, we will talk more in the future, as we have done before, I'm sure, about the idea of the person as brain, because we talked about it in Three-Body Problem. We've kind of touched on it today. It seems to be quite a popular one at the moment in terms of ideas around identity. So that will feed back into your areas of things to some degree. So anything else you wanted to say about this film? I feel like we've taken it in a slightly strange sort of series of directions, but I hope it was interesting.
Yeah, I guess.
Missed?
I mean, I feel like overall the kind of messages, we all need to aspire a little bit to be like Truman, to sort of question what is fed to us in the given reality. Well, especially in this time of high spreading of false information and things, to not just take everything at face value. I guess I'd say it's like the main takeaway.
Yeah, I think that is a particularly good parallel to draw. Yes. And definitely, this kind of, again, this question about like how much of ourselves do we give away for safety within our societies. Okay, he's not doing it consciously, but the idea is still there that that's kind of how you achieve a utopia, as well as these ideas of kind of individual liberty plays in to a certain degree there. There's also one last thing which I was going to mention, which is this idea of kind of like the way that we perform ourselves within society, and we don't have enough time to get like fully into kind of Judith Butler and things like that, but it struck me that there was a really interesting parallel there between like Truman, who is sort of like being himself, which everyone says is it's real, none of it is pretense, but it seems to be a performance, because everything we do is a performance. Everything we do when we interact with other people is that. And I thought it was interesting the way in which he finishes by using that tagline, the good afternoon, good evening, and good night, before he steps through the door, almost like it's the end of one performance. And although he will continue to perform his identity, he will no longer perform it within the particular stage that he has been within, playing the role that has been cast for him.
Particular audience. That was
so again, this thing about performing yourself, yes, it will always be a performance, but making choices over that, whether that's with regards to kind of gender presentation, color of your hair, how you kind of present yourself. All of these things are actually kind of like conscious decisions that we should be free to make for ourselves. There you go. So it's also quite a funny film. It's also very heartwarming. Jim Carrey is brilliant. Generally, the cast is brilliant. We would recommend. Even if you don't want to dig into the many articles I'm going to put into the notes.
Yes.
Lovely. Okay. Thank you very much, Masha.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to our lovely listeners. And do check us out on Instagram, Dystopian Fiction Current Affairs. We'll update you about what's going on over the summer when Masha is off on tour in Europe. And so we'll be having a little bit of a shift of focus. But we will be back in July with our episode on Fallout, which you should have plenty of time to catch before then if you've not seen it yet.
Yes. All right.
Okay.